Okay, thank you for joining the webinar today. I am Kimball Parker, the CEO of SixFifty. And for those of you who are hearing about SixFifty for the first time, we are the technology arm of the law firm Wilson Sonsini. And Wilson Sonsini primarily, or actually now they do a lot of things, but one of the things that they're known for is helping technology companies. And so they helped found Apple and brought them public. Same with Google, Twitter, Lyft, Tesla, SpaceX. They represent some of the largest, most fun technology companies in the world. We work with Wilson Sonsini to create automated legal products like TurboTax, but with the best lawyers in the nation behind it. And the idea is to bring down the price so that you don't have to be Apple to afford Wilson Sonsini's legal help. And so we have a really fun job. We build products for businesses who need legal help, and we also build products for people who need legal help. And we've helped over 14,000 people at risk of losing their homes during the pandemic, all for free, with an automated tool called hellolandlord.org. But today we're going to be talking about what impact COVID has had on employment law, what aspects will be temporary and what aspects will likely be permanent. And this is a very complicated subject. We have some really interesting expertise in this area that I'm going to give you a little background on. Wilson Sonsini has some of the best employment experts in the nation. And a lot of our customers and a lot of the firm's clients have been struggling to figure out what to do with the layers of law relating to the layers of employment law that relate to COVID, and just generally what to do to comply with those, and also how to adjust to the new way that people are working. And so we worked with Wilson Sonsini to build some automated legal tools to help companies handle this situation. So we have a return to work tool set that has the assessments and policies that a company needs to keep up with those layers of law of the COVID regulations, and the tool can keep companies up to date with the changes in the law. And we also developed an automated employee handbook that has over 50 employment policies that account for COVID and a workplace that's more remote and mobile. And those policies account for the law in every state in the nation. So we update these policies both in the return to work and the employee handbook on a regular basis, so that they never go out of date. So anyway, I'm telling you this because you're going to hear from two of the main people who helped build those tools, the return to work tool and the employee handbook tool. So the first is Ryan Parker. He graduated near the top of his class from the University of Michigan, which is one of the top law schools in the nation. He clerked for 2 different judges, including a judge on the Third Circuit. He spent a decade working for the Justice Department, litigating some of the most important high-profile cases for the government. And a big part of his practice actually was employment law. And so we were lucky enough to be able to pull him away. And so Ryan works for us now, and you'll be hearing from him. Second, you're going to hear from Marie Colbeth. She graduated, like Ryan, near the top of her class from one of the best law schools in the nation. She clerked for a federal circuit judge in the South, in the Fifth Circuit. She worked in private practice and then was a professor at BYU Law School, and we poached Marie from BYU. And one of the best decisions we ever made. So it's not an exaggeration to say that Marie and Ryan are two of the foremost experts about how COVID has affected employment law, and how it'll likely affect employment law in the future. So really excited to hear from them. 2 plugs, and then we'll be off to the races. If you want to learn more about our employee handbook, you can go to SixFifty.com/handbook. And if you want to learn about our return to work offering, you can go to www.SixFifty.com/return to work, all one word. Second, today's webinar is CLE eligible. We will post a code in the middle of the webinar. Write that code down, and we'll email you the form and instructions about how to get credit. Again, well, we're posting those URLs into the chat function if you want to learn more about the products. One final thing I'll say, if you could put your questions into the Q&A and not into the chat, that helps us catalog the questions and answer them, and then potentially send them out after the webinar. So if any questions, put it into the Q&A, not the chat. So with that, Marie and Ryan, take it away.
Thank you, Kimball. We're excited for this webinar and for the opportunity to present to you about the impacts of COVID-19 on employment law, what's temporary and what's permanent. We hope this will be a discussion, and we ask that if you have questions, you put them in the Q&A. We'll try to answer those questions as they come in, if they're sort of on the topic we're covering, or at the end during our Q&A session. We're also going to put out some polls so you can see what your fellow webinars are doing with regard to some interesting issues, like health screeners and remote work. And we're really looking forward to presenting and having a back and forth with you on this. So why don't I start by just going through a brief agenda so you have a feel for what we're going to talk about. We're going to start with the introduction. We're doing that now. And then we're going to set the scene and talk a little about the pandemic and sort of what has changed over the last a little over a year and how we got here. Then we're going to talk about what's going to stay. And that will include a discussion of vaccinations, health screeners, remote work, employee relocation, and video conferencing, all things that you are probably very familiar with at this point in the pandemic. And then we're going to pivot just a little bit and talk about lessons learned, what we're seeing some of the best businesses do and some of the best practices that are emerging from the pandemic. And I think are positioning businesses for success moving forward in the new workplace. And we'll talk specifically about employee handbooks. That's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and we have, I think, some interesting insights on. And then we'll also look at clear communication, health and wellness, and becoming more nimble. And as I said, we'll save some time at the end for Q&A, and we'll also answer questions throughout. So let's dive right in and talk about March 11th, 2020. It's interesting, if you look back in history, there's some days that people talk about where they were when we landed on the moon, or on September 11th. I think people may remember March 11th, 2020. The day began with Dr. Fauci from the CDC testifying before Congress. At the time, there were less than 700, at least according to some news outlets, less than 700 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the United States. But Dr. Fauci summed up his testimony by saying, the bottom line, it's going to get worse. And boy, was he right. Within a few hours, the WHO had declared COVID-19 a pandemic. I think that had been coming for some time. But later that evening, a player from my favorite professional basketball team, the Utah Jazz, tested positive for COVID. And after Rudy Gobert, sometimes known as the Stifle Tower for his amazing block shots, tested positive, they canceled the NBA season. They suspended the season. They canceled the game. And for us, that was a moment where we realized that things were going to change dramatically for us as a business. And we decided at that point that people should not come in the next day and we were going to start working remotely. On that very day, businesses started to receive COVID-19 guidelines from multiple sources. And as an example, in San Francisco, Mayor London Breed announced via tweet, which I guess is the new way that we announce laws in our country, that they were prohibiting gatherings of over 1,000 people. And Governor Jay Inslee in Washington banned events of 250 people or more in the Seattle region. And so right away, we started to see governments step in and respond to the pandemic. And over time, we sort of developed these layers. On a federal level, we saw guidance from the CDC, from the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and from OSHA. On the state level, we saw governor's offices, state departments of health, and state OSHA offices putting out different regulations. And locally, we saw counties and cities putting out regulations. And so almost overnight, businesses were faced with a sort of multi-layered maze of regulations that they had to consider as they tried to keep their business moving. And this was something that we confronted at 650 as well. And that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to have Marie here. She's actually in addition to working on our legal products team, she's our GC, and she's helped us as a company to navigate a lot of these things. So let's talk about what changed, right? We had closed work sites. Companies had to shift almost overnight to remote work. And I think for many companies, that was a challenge. Companies that were still trying to come into the office were required to have health screening, masks, social distancing, occupancy limits, reconfigured workspaces. And now we're dealing with vaccinations, right? And the way that vaccinations are affecting the workplace and the pandemic. And those have been big changes, things that businesses didn't have to think about in the past. And we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about kind of what's likely to stick around and what is likely to change or even disappear as the pandemic continues. And at this point, I'll turn the time over to Marie to begin our discussion of what is likely to remain as we talk about a changed workforce.
Thanks, Ryan. And I apologize. There's just a little bit of an issue going off the slides right now. If you just give it a second, they'll be your primary window if they're not already. So that's getting fixed on the back end as we speak. But while that's happening, I'll just go ahead and sort of dive in and talk a little bit about, what we're expecting to see stay the same. So, we've all navigated, we've all pivoted, as Ryan's been discussing. And some of the main things that we've done to respond to what has been going on with the pandemic is, increased safety requirements that we're implementing in our workplaces. And some of those, as Ryan mentioned, are the result of guidelines that are coming out from the federal, state, and local government. Some of them are more based just on awareness of your employees' concerns and the particular needs in your industry. And so, you sometimes will see that some businesses have regulations in place that put higher requirements on their employees and on their visitors than are necessarily required by the government. And so that's the sort of, risk management approach that pretty much every business has had to try to make some decisions about whether to stick strictly with what you're required to do or to go a little further. And that's something that we're going to expect to see continue. So as we talk today, we're going to talk about, employee health awareness in terms of, most companies are now becoming much more informed and asking a lot more questions about what's going on with their employees' health. That includes both vaccinations, which is absolutely the topic of the day with our most recent CDC update, and health screenings, which most companies have been doing in some form or fashion for the last year if they're allowing employees to come into the workplace at all, and which we're going to discuss sort of how that will continue into the future. And then just additional parts of the changed work environment that for a number of reasons we're anticipating will remain. And a lot of the legal changes, the necessary employment policy changes that you've put into place will either remain or some version of them will remain. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. And we're going to start, because it's top of mind, because of the most recent update from the CDC, we're going to start today by diving in on vaccinations.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. And as Kimball mentioned, we're helping hundreds of businesses with the return to work. And we are, the questions that we're getting the most often are about vaccinations. I think vaccinations are on everyone's mind as businesses look at returning to work and what's happening. As most of you are probably aware, on May 16th, the CDC put out new guidance for people who are fully vaccinated. And it was very hopeful. Right? The guidance said that fully vaccinated individuals may, and I quote, resume activities without wearing a mask or staying 6 feet apart. I think that was news that many of us have been waiting to hear for a long time. Unfortunately, that CDC guidance came with a caveat, except where required by federal, state, local, tribal, and other laws. And so, a lot of businesses have reached out to us and said, hey, the CDC says we don't have to wear masks, we don't have to social distance. We probably don't have to do health screening if we're vaccinated. We're ready to get back to work. And the truth is actually that a lot of times state and local governments take a little while to adjust to the CDC's guidance. And so in a lot of states, including states like California, where the emergency temporary standards that have been put in place by OSHA, by Cal OSHA, have not changed, nothing has really changed for employees. And so we're still waiting, and we're seeing actually relatively quickly states and localities adjust to this new CDC guidance. Interestingly, in that CDC guidance, and as we mentioned, we're going to send you these slides after the presentation. I put in some hyperlinks so you can follow this to the source documents if you'd like. But the CDC points out that we're still learning how long vaccines protect people and how effective they are against variants. And so there are a lot of questions still about vaccines. How often are you going to have to get a booster? How often are we going to have to change vaccines based on variants? There's some really interesting questions. But as we sort of move on to the next part of this vaccine discussion, it's important to remember all the way back to December of 2020, when the EEOC clarified that in many cases, employers can require employees to be vaccinated in order to enter their work sites. And that clarification really opened the door for companies to think about what they wanted to do with their vaccination policies. There are really kind of three options. They can require vaccinations in most instances, they can encourage vaccinations, or they can choose not to do anything as far as encouraging or requiring vaccinations. And companies, I think, have wrestled with this choice. We have done a number of vaccine-related webinars, and we've worked with a number of companies, and what we have seen is that many employers are choosing sort of the middle ground to encourage vaccinations, and some are even providing incentives for their employees to be vaccinated. Even those companies that are choosing to encourage rather than require vaccinations, however, most of them, among those companies, most of them are collecting information about who has been vaccinated. And I think that's been really helpful for them as they do their risk analysis. And as we're working with companies, they want to know, for example, if they have a office location, they want to know how many people are vaccinated within their office location so they can make decisions about the rules there. Or if they have, for example, a loading dock where suppliers are coming in and out, they want to know kind of what the vaccination status of those employees is so that they can decide, how quickly they're going to open, how many people they're going to let in, what the rules are going to be. And that information is actually proving very valuable. I think as we move forward, that we're really just at the beginning of COVID-19 vaccinations. I think we're going to see a situation where people have to receive boosters. I think they're going to come out with new vaccines as we see variants, and that businesses may be required or in a situation where they want to track the vaccination status of their workers moving forward. And that will be an interesting issue to watch. We already have seen some localities that are requiring businesses to track and to know who among their workforce is vaccinated as we start to see some of the other restrictions around masks, social distancing, occupancy limits be loosened.
And Ryan, I think this is a great time for us to address something that actually just came up in the chat and does seem to come up every time we talk about vaccines, is the understanding, if for those who aren't aware, that right now the vaccines are authorized under an emergency use authorization, which is a little different than what we typically see with a vaccine that hasn't been fast-tracked the way that the COVID-19 vaccines have been. But understanding what that means for liability for a business if they do implement a mandatory vaccine policy, and how in this situation that might affect what businesses are trying to decide to do. So maybe you could talk about that for just a second.
Yeah, it's a great question, Maria, and it's one that we've received quite a bit. Obviously, the vaccines that have been approved in the United States, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, have gone through a fast process and received emergency authorization. And under that authorization, they've been made available to the public. And our understanding is that based on OSHA guidance, that employers are not going to be held responsible if for some reason there's a problem with the vaccines that affects employees. That's very, very unlikely to be something that would fall on the employer, even if vaccines are required. And so on that front, I think that liability is very unlikely. If, as an employee or an employer, you have an employee who gets COVID-19 at your workplace, and I'm not sure this is where the question was going, but sort of the other side of that litigation coin, it depends largely on what state you're in and what steps you've taken to protect your employees whether or not a business could be held liable. In some states, there are liability shields, but in many cases, I think, courts would look at whether a business has taken reasonable steps to protect their employees. And I think a business would be well situated if they, for example, incentivized or encouraged employees to be vaccinated, or at least had clear communication about that, and had used vaccination information to make a calculated risk analysis. Things like that, I think, could go a long way to protecting businesses.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll also say that question also asked a little bit about differences between state and federal law. For those who are using our return to work tool, that's a great option for being able to track where the differences might be. But one in particular related to vaccines that I've noted, just because I do this for our company and our biggest office is in Utah, there's a specific rule in place that says, no government access or government benefit can be predicated on requiring somebody to have the vaccine while it's under emergency use authorization. So that's an example of where you may have some differences between federal and state rules that may impact your business. So for example, if your business is a state contractor in the state of Utah, then you also fall into this coverage. Like you won't be able to deny somebody access to your premises, for example, if they haven't been vaccinated. So there's some state and federal places where there may be some friction, and you'll need to look specifically at what that friction is in the states where you operate.
Yeah, there certainly is an interesting interplay, thanks, Marie, between the federal, the state, and the local guidance as we get it. On some level, the CDC, for example, just gives guidelines that aren't enforceable, but those guidelines really inform the standards typically that are put in place at the state and local level. Whereas, for example, guidance that comes out from the EEOC, that would apply directly to employers, right, when it comes to employment discrimination. And so it is important that employers pay attention to the guidelines that apply to them in different areas. And that could be, in some cases, federal, some cases state, and in others, county and even city guidance. One area where we've seen a lot of different guidelines, and especially actually very active cities and counties, is on employee health screening. Employee health screening varies widely across states and localities. For example, it's required in states like California, Massachusetts, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, New York. In other states, it's recommended, and in other states have no requirements about health screening. But for many Americans, health screening has just become a part of their everyday work life, and they're used to getting on and filling out a health screener. We provide a health screener for our customers that's just on a URL, and you just click on it, you click a couple buttons, and you automatically get an email that tells you come into work or don't come into work. And it takes all of about 30 seconds, and you fill it out. And I think that's kind of what we're used to when it comes to coming into the office. And I think it's interesting because the question that we've received frequently with regard to health screening is, do I still have to screen my employees who have been vaccinated? And in most cases, the answer remains yes, but that may be because state and local laws have not yet been updated to account for the CDC's new guidance. And it'll be interesting as we start to see those change. But I will say many workplaces have individuals who cannot receive the vaccine for either medical reasons or because they have a sincerely held religious belief. And so I think you'll have workplaces that have individuals who have not been vaccinated. That could lead to a situation where you have at least a portion of your employee population who need to continue to be screened based on state and local laws. The other thing that's interesting to me, although there was a lot of grumbling initially about health screening, I think some employers are actually seeing a benefit sort of beyond COVID-19 in that they have employees who for years have been coming into work when they were sick with the flu or with even just a common cold, who are now being forced to stay home. And I actually have heard from some employers that they want to continue to use a health screener. It only takes 30 seconds before someone leaves their house, and they want to keep sick individuals from coming into their office place because having sick individuals at the office place can lead to more sick individuals and can really harm the productivity of a business. And so we actually have a poll here that we want to put up, and we'd invite all of you to kind of think about this. And the question is, do you anticipate using a health screener in the future? Your choices are yes, whether or not it is required, only if it's required, no, or unsure. This is an issue that we've heard anecdotally from a number of businesses about, but we thought it would be interesting to ask you. We have nearly 100 people on our webinar, 100 businesses. And so we'd love to hear kind of what your thoughts are about health screeners moving forward, because we think this is something that may be here to stay for some businesses. And we think this is kind of an interesting issue. I will say, just while you're voting, as an attorney, this is something that really took me some time to get used to, because for years, I told my clients not to collect health data from their employees, because when you do collect health data, it is subject to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it has to be stored outside of an employee's personnel file. It has to be kept confidential. And, there are a whole bunch of requirements and complications that can come with collecting health data. And so, before the pandemic, that was sort of something that I told all of my clients, do not collect health data. Now companies across the country are collecting health data from their employees on a daily basis. So I think this is a really interesting change that we've seen. And I think that, this collection of health data may be something that's here to stay. I'm going to ask our support team to put up the results, if they can, to the poll, and let's see how that looks, if we're able to do that. Interesting. Okay, so we have about 50% of the businesses are unsure. They're still thinking about it, which makes sense. This is an emerging trend. We have 9 who have said no, 34, about a third, who have said only if required, and about 10 who are thinking about doing it, whether it's required or not. They like health screening and they think that it's helpful. I think that's interesting. I think those numbers are maybe along the lines that I thought. I'm a little surprised that there were a third that said only if it's required, but I think this may be representative of what we see in the larger business community. So I appreciate everyone taking part of that poll. I think those are some interesting stats for us to consider about health screening moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, in particular, given the fact that, we're still sort of in the stage where we're coming out of the pandemic. But I would say, that 1/3 is probably reflective of what I see from a lot of our employees here at 650, which is them sending me the messages like, are we still taking that? Like, really? Right? People are tired. And I can absolutely understand that. But, there's all these different things that we have to take into account as we decide what our policies are going to be. And I think that this is also really indicative, if you're thinking about continuing a health screener, I think a big part of it is related to the idea of remote work. In the past, employees were coming in sick because they were concerned about missing work, missing deadlines, not getting the face time and therefore the recognition for their work. But, with the new remote work opportunities that we've now learned we can engage in, if you have a screener that says stay home, it doesn't necessarily mean that the employee can't work that day. And so that's a really big change that I think most of us are seeing in our workforces. If you're not in, a place or dealing with an employee whose job is one of those frontline type jobs where you do have to be there to interact with a customer or client type of situation. So if we could advance the slide to the next slide, please. A little bit of a delay there. I'll just keep talking. So with this, and so I talk about remote work as, one of the reasons why you might continue with a screener, but also because, in the future, we're going to see continued disasters, things that prevent people from coming into the office. Depending on where your locations are, you may see these in the form of natural disasters. We have a lot of wildfires in the West, which is where a lot of our employees at 650 are. We have, other employees who are in Florida who deal with hurricanes. We have, well, these aren't employees, but I have family right now who's been through some severe flooding in Louisiana. There's lots of reasons that people won't be able to come into the office. So something like a health screener may be one of the ways that you navigate towards that future. But remote work is also a way that you can be nimble and navigate in the future as we face like increased reasons people may not be able to attend. Future pandemics are definitely a possibility, but also remote work as an accommodation. Ryan mentioned the ADA. one of the important things we need to think about is how has this last year of working changed the way your company works? And so in the past, you may have had employees who sought accommodations, and one of the accommodations they may have sought was to be able to work from home. And your company may have said, that doesn't work for us. And a court, an adjudicator looking at that as whether or not you should have allowed somebody to work from home in the past would have been more likely to agree with you than we're going to start seeing now. As a practical matter, if you've been able to successfully work remotely during the pandemic, it's going to be a harder argument to make if somebody asks for or brings an action against you for not providing that type of accommodation in the future. So I think that's a really, while the law itself isn't changing, I think the interpretation, the practical application is going to change in that sense with accommodations. We're also, I think, moving into a place where we're starting to see remote work as more and more of an incentive. Employees, we took a poll yesterday, or 2 days ago. I do so many of these webinars. We took a poll and discovered that, we had, 70% of employees who plan to continue to work from home on at least some sort of hybrid basis, 3 days a week or less in the office. Sorry, 3 days a week, most likely at home. And so that's a big change. And for offices that are able to do that, it can be a great incentive for people that are seeking, more balance, or for other reasons they may have found that they've actually been more successful in the remote work environment. So that's something we're going to continue to see. And companies are looking at it as an incentive. They're also looking at it as a standard operating procedure because it could increase in some businesses productivity. It's lowering facilities cost if you're able to hotel maybe more employees out of one facility because they're not all there at the same time. There's things that could really benefit a lot of workplaces by continuing this. One thing to keep in mind if you are thinking about continuing remote work policies is OSHA guidance. So under OSHA, you have a responsibility to provide a safe workplace for your employees. And that includes, interestingly, there's guidance that says that does include remote work. So if somebody's working from home, you've given them permission to work from home, they need a safe workplace. However, OSHA has also given guidance that says we're not going to go out and investigate the homes of your 3,000 employees, but you are going to be on notice for things that you're aware of. So say you're on remote calls with an employee on your team and you see every day that, behind them, there's a very concerning looking electrical outlet with exposed wires. You can see it on the video. You're on notice now that's a hazard in their workspace. So you need to help them take some steps towards mitigation. And that's something I think most companies haven't thought of in the past, but it has come up a lot more this year with concerns about liability and risk in the remote workplace versus in the work sites where you have direct supervisory abilities. So that's a difference you should be thinking about. And one of the ways you can mitigate for that, right, which is through training, when you have people who are going to remote work or you're hiring for remote positions, having in place some policies about the safety of their workplaces and training them on ways they can mitigate potential hazards. So for example, we share an office tower with a company that's moved to remote work, and they were sending their employees home with all of this equipment, but they were not sending them home with any of their sit-stand desks because they had found through their own installation of those desks that they were a tipping hazard if not installed properly, and they knew they couldn't send it home with 500 employees and have them all install them themselves. So they didn't send any of that equipment there because they were aware that it would create a hazard. So those are the sorts of things that you can do to stay OSHA compliant, but still picking up on the benefits of remote work. And then just one of the other asides that I thought was interesting was, as we move into this and we talk about it as incentives, for people to be able to work remotely, there also could be some environmental community-based incentives that could be something that you want to talk about in your brand awareness. And then that sort of conversation that could help with recruiting and other things with your workforce. If you're a company that considers part of its mission to be, being climate aware or building, sustainable communities, fewer commutes. We've seen London's already done a study on their air, and their emissions have been reduced 25% in the morning and 34% during the evening commutes during the pandemic. So that's making a big difference in their air quality. So, fewer commutes, fewer paper. People don't print things at home. They only print things in the office. Reduced power consumption. That one, there's, I think the jury's still out on whether we've really reduced power consumption because people are now consuming power at home, but there's studies kind of showing at least a little bit of improvement. And then I threw on gardening onto the slide because I know Ryan has been doing a little bit of this as part of his pandemic response with his remote work.
It's true. In fact, since I've been working at home, we've started to do some composting. I've had, more time because I have less commute. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. The other thing that I'm seeing is less traffic as more people are working at home. And I think that's been a benefit. The other thing that I've loved as a company is our ability to recruit nationally rather than being restrained by where we have office locations. And I think that's been interesting as we're looking to expand our teams, that we can look for the best candidates regardless of where they live without sort of being restricted to the places where we have offices that they could go to. And I think that's something that I think is a big benefit to allowing remote work, and is something we're likely to see companies lean heavily on, is the ability to recruit more widely. It's one thing though to recruit an employee who lives far away. It's another thing if you have an employee who moved during the pandemic, and I think that's something we've seen a lot of questions about, right, Marie?
We have seen a lot of it. We've even seen it in our own company. We had a team member who works with Ryan and I who relocated over the weekend across the country. One quick thing before I talk about that, though, I did notice there were a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to hit on quickly. One was regarding, well, can you have somebody attest that they have a safe environment in their home? And I think the answer is yes.
Yes.
The workplace employment policies that you put in place, you should, if you're going to have remote work as part of it, have a remote working policy that does require that they have a safe space and that they attest to you either by signing the general acknowledgement or a specific one, that they do have access to that. Because again, like you have the right as a business to set certain requirements on your employees. And if they want to work remotely, you can say, well, we require you to have these things if we're going to do that. Similarly, somebody was asking whether you're responsible for repairs if their work sites are unsafe. That's a very interesting question that honestly will probably be answered in part by the answer to the question of what's in your remote working policy. Because you can set up in your policy that they have to have it safe from the outset. And if those cords were exposed before they started working for you, then it's not your responsibility. So that one gets like much more factual. And in those situations, I'd say for sure, those are great examples of when you should maybe be talking with, your HR and risk management team in addition to your counsel. Because there are a lot of really new fact-based situations that you're going to have to decide how you're going to handle them from a policy perspective, and then handle them on the ground after having set your policy.
Yeah, it's a great point, Marie. I mean, some of that also could depend on your reimbursement policy, right? If you're having folks work at home, you need to be thinking about reimbursement. Are you going to buy them a desk? Are you going to buy them additional monitors? Are you going to pay for improvements to their office space? I think companies do a lot of different things on that. And I would say generally, you're probably not required to fix someone's outlet. But that is the kind of thing that you'd want to check with your HR manager to see what your policies say, and you may want to consult with counsel. I think that's an interesting example.
Yeah. So those are all things that are going to be coming up in remote work. And as Ryan said, remote work also leads us to relocation, a big thing that a lot of employees are asking about these days. We've actually seen some interesting numbers regarding relocation coming out. Right now, we've seen among Gen Z, which I always forget like which categories are which. So Gen Z is those 18 to 24-year-olds. We've seen 31% of them moving during the pandemic. Millennials, which are ages 25 to 40. I know that there's some disagreements about which age groups are the cutoffs, but for the research that was done, 25 to 40, we were seeing 26% of people in that age group moving. But what I think is interesting, and what I think we're just now starting to really understand, is that most of those moves have not been those cross-country moves like I mentioned our colleague undertaking. Most of them have been within the same metro area. And so a lot of it is people saying, well, I don't have to commute into my office. I could move a little further away and still maybe go in when I have to. But the majority of the time, I could be working from home in a less expensive area. And so we're seeing, some movement out of the urban centers, particularly in those younger age groups that we haven't seen before. And so that's been like a lot of what we're seeing with relocation. But there are also those who are wanting to move closer to family who may be across the country. We're seeing people who maybe, have a partner who has a job opportunity somewhere, and if they could relocate and work remotely, it would work really well for them as a team. So we're starting to see like companies be asked these questions that before I think a lot of employees were hesitant to even suggest because nobody else was doing it. So with that relocation, what you need to think about in terms of, the go forward, the future is, well, what does that mean for us from a policies and procedures standpoint? If you're relocating within the metro area, that's one thing. We're still subject to all the same laws, we're subject to all the same regulations. But if you're moving from, say, you know, I don't know, Ryan's in DC. If you're moving from DC to California, it's a really different ballgame in terms of what I need to do when I register with the state of the California as an employer, with what I have to offer in terms of benefits. There's really different things that I need to look at in my benefits and in my policies and procedures packages, in addition to just registrations and unemployment insurance and all of those things. So what we're seeing a lot of companies start to do is say, well, we need to think about this. We need to be able to recruit. We need to be able to, help our workforce, feel like they're really benefiting from working with us. So how can we do that? Tax consultants are great when you're looking at which states are better for your business. But also, sit down, work with HR, go through those employee handbooks, multiple state options. SixFifty provides this as one of our services. We have a multi-state handbook that covers all 50 states. And you can say, like, if we go here, what changes? If we go there, what's different? And maybe what you need to do is pre-approve some states and say, you know what, these states, the laws are similar enough. We feel comfortable. We're willing to let employees go there. These other states maybe are too different from where we're already operating. We can't, adjust to those changes. So we're not going to allow those states. So, pre-approval can really go a long way towards helping your employees know what they can expect, what you'll say no to, because if you have a policy in place regarding relocation, you'll be able to refer to that policy instead of having to make a new decision every time, which could lead to, again, like anytime you're making a case-by-case decision as opposed to a policy-based decision, it could lead to some problems with discrimination and disparate impact and things along those lines. So you want to be really careful and make your decisions, if at all possible, ahead of time as opposed to after the fact.
Marie, that's a great point. And I think, employers are in a tough spot, right? Because if you've signed an employment contract while your employee was in California and it's based on California law, and then your employee moves, for example, to Montana, where they don't allow at-will employment, all of a sudden the employment relationship between the company and the employee has changed in a significant way, just based on changes in state law. And so I do think it's important that companies sort of keep in mind that there are more than just tax implications to having your employees move. And I have heard anecdotally from a number of different people at different companies and within the government who have had employees move, and the company was unaware that the employee moved. And so, they've been in the government, you're sometimes paid location pay based on where you live, and they're receiving location pay for Washington, D.C., but they're living in Missouri or something. You've got some issues there beyond just tax implications. And so I think this is a complicated issue. You also raised the employee handbook as an example, right? There are different leave requirements for different states. And so you want to make sure that you've covered your bases based on where you have employees.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the most important things to consider, the employment contract. If these employees that are relocating, if you have an employment contract with them, that is really what governs that relationship. And so if they relocated without telling you, it's a big problem for both of you, but especially for them, because the most likely outcome is that you would be within your rights to let them go. Again, like I say, most likely look at your own contracts and the laws that apply. But that's a really big deal. And so again, like from that policy perspective, if you can let employees know, hey, we have a relocation policy in place. If you violate it by, for example, moving without telling us, the outcome could be that we let you go and you're not going to have recourse. You need to talk to us ahead of time so we can game plan the best outcome for everybody. Because again, like we've seen a lot of people do those like under the radar moves during the pandemic. There's a lot of stories. A lot of people on this call probably have those stories. In fact, we thought it would be interesting to poll the audience today and find out who among you have employees who have relocated during the pandemic. Yes, no, and unsure. Unsure is for those people who are like, well, as Ryan said, some people we think are low key, like it seems like they're always joining from a different time zone, or I saw their background one day. It definitely looked like the beach. So that is happening, we think. So we'll leave that open for just a minute.
Sometimes I just set my background to look like the beach, so I feel like I'm there. But I do think that employees are moving, and I'm interested to see what our poll results look like.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind if this was my general background every day. I'd be okay with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's been one of the major things though that we've seen with relocation. Like remote work definitely makes it possible, but there are legal considerations. There's just operational considerations. One that I didn't mention that I've thought about is time zones. The team that I work on, we actually benefit by having people in multiple time zones. But for some teams who really need to be able to work together synchronously as much as possible, they need to be in the same time zone. They need to be working the same hours. At the same time, though, we've seen, a lot of other companies who say have shift work opportunities in a way that they didn't in the past, because you could come in remotely, take a few hours, and then report remotely again. So it really depends on your business. So let's go ahead and close that poll and pop the answers up for everybody to see. Relocation is a norm this year, 74%. So that's really high, right? And that's not, I think for most businesses in a normal year, that would not have been the answer. So keep in mind, relocation is a big part of this. And related to relocation is, how do you negotiate that? You negotiate through video conferencing, which has become the new norm for everybody this year. We all know how to use Zoom and Teams and GoToMeeting and all of those platforms now. And that's another thing that will stay the same. And the big thing with video conferencing is, again, policies. Do you have certain platforms that your employees have to use? Are they only allowed to use, the company's video conferencing platform through their username and ID? Are people sharing usernames and IDs? Is that a security risk for your company? Do you have rules about background filters? I just popped up the beach a minute ago. Ryan and I generally turn on the 650 filters when we're on webinars, but other days, we have, backgrounds that are more reflective of our personalities and who we are outside of business. Is that okay at your company? Or are there rules around that? There's a lot of things to think about just in terms of training your employees to this new normal. Whether you're using, recordings, if you're allowing your employees to record video conferencing meetings, have you trained them about laws regarding, getting consent? And laws are different in different states. I live in a 2-party consent state. I can't record without telling Ryan and getting his permission to record him. I can't just be like, well, I consented and I'm here. But in some states that is sufficient. So you have to think through, well, who's engaging on our platforms? Have we trained them on how to do that appropriately? And then I think most importantly, from everybody's perspective, honestly, is the security side. Have you set standard security rules in place? Are you monitoring those? Are you ensuring that any data that might be shared between your team members or people who are outsiders to your organization that are joining meetings, is that information protected? Especially if you're sharing confidential financial type information or other things of higher sensitivity. So these things that hopefully you've gotten a policy in place, but if you haven't, I would say this is definitely the time to think about it for your company, because the future of work is in some way remote. Whether or not your business may, you may all go back to the work site, but you're going to be working with others, clients, vendors who are remote. And so you need to get this in place so that your company is ready to do that appropriately.
Yeah, it's a great point, Maria. It's interesting how much of business now occurs over video conferencing and how few businesses have thought through the implications of that and put policies in place. I think that's really crucial moving forward. We're going to pivot a little bit to lessons learned and best practices. And we're going to sort of talk about how businesses have used the pandemic to make changes that will benefit them moving forward and sort of prepare them for future changes and what best practices are emerging. And we're going to do it relatively quickly because we want to have some time for questions. But One of the things that we've seen at 650 is that companies are sort of rethinking about their handbook. I think in the past, the handbook was, a big collection of papers that you gave to someone on their first day. They used it to maybe fill some downtime and then stuck it in their bottom drawer and never looked at it again. That's not what the handbook looks like today with people being remote. Now, instead of being able to get up from your desk and walk down to your HR person in the office, employees are looking in their handbook to see what to do when they get a jury summons and whether they can take time off, or whether if they need bereavement leave, or whether they have meal and rest breaks. And so the handbook, I think a lot of companies are realizing their handbook needs to be a resource for employees. It can't be written in legalese. It needs to be accessible to employees, and it needs to be kept up to date. The other thing is that I think often we have situations where in the past, employees were able to sort of understand the expectations based on who they saw at the office and the behavior they saw at the office. And now that you're not in the office together, I think handbooks are playing a bigger role in setting expectations in a changing work environment, including video conferencing, right? What's appropriate, what's not appropriate. Handbooks have always been used to meet legal needs, and I think that's even more the case now. We've talked about relocation, we've talked about video conferencing, all these different things. And then finally, company culture is important. And companies, I think, used to be in a position to create culture through sort of events that they held at their offices or shared experiences. And now they're having to create culture sometimes with a diffuse workforce. And that can be a challenge. And the handbook could be a part of meeting that challenge by putting in a company's mission statement, its values, having policies that reflect the company's values, that are consistent with their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, that are consistent with their environmental goals. And I think you could do a lot to strengthen company culture through a handbook. And we're seeing more and more companies that are revisiting their handbook, and they're sort of evaluating how they want it to be used, and how it can be an important tool in their tool set.
Yeah, I think that is the biggest change really overall, right? The fact that these policies now are dynamic. They're not static the way they have been for years, and they really are starting to matter in everyday life for a number of employees. So really quickly, just for anyone who needs it, the CLE code for this meeting is 195 WMK, M as in Mary. And you'll get a follow-up email that will give you instructions on how to use the code. But thank you if you're joining for CLE credit. And I'll just also jump off of what Ryan was saying with sort of a follow-up thought on that, which is, with these handbooks and things, one of the most important things is to clearly communicate what's in there to your employees. If they don't know what's in the handbook, the policy is really essentially meaningless. And I think we've seen in new ways the importance of really clear communication with workforces this year, as you've had to be very dynamic. You've had to pivot quickly. You've had to respond to new regulations, new outbreaks in your community that may have put, the level of threat, it may have made it higher than what was coming out in the regulations that you were seeing. So you had to make some decisions that you came to on your own. It's been a tough year. And I think HR, risk analysis groups, risk management groups, legal, they've all had to deal with quite a bit. And so congratulations on making it this far. Stay clear in terms of what you communicate to your employees. Clearly communicate things to your customers so that they, like your employees, can feel safe, can feel trust in you and your brand. And as you're going through this, I think we've also learned the importance of incorporating departments in all of your decision making, and incorporating employees from different levels within those departments in the decision making, because the worker out on the loading dock, in Ryan's example, the person interacting at the cash register, they're aware of risk in a way that your C-suite may not be, because they're engaging those interactions every day. So clearly communicating, listening back in return, being sort of the regulatory messenger to your employees, I think is a new place that companies have found themselves this year, but I think we're going to see it continue. There's a lot of conflicting information, and having the workplace be clear, be helpful, has really translated over into health and wellness in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before. Health and wellness, I used to think of as something just for big companies, like really big companies that could invest in it. because they're big enough that their insurance costs would go down if they had a health and wellness program. But now I think we all understand, whatever our size, whatever our industry, health and wellness of our employees is incredibly important. Mental health, familial health, in a way I don't think a lot of companies have thought about before, and resources to help support our employees and their families. So I think that we've seen that as one of the major changes coming out of this. Health and wellness is not something that's just for the big companies anymore. It's something for everybody, and employee stress impacts the business. Employee happiness impacts the business, and so make your policies work from a regulatory perspective, but make them work for your employees, and that's where you're going to get a lot of positive outcomes, I think, from what has felt like a very negative year. Ryan, you're on mute.
Thanks, Marie. I think those are some really good points. I mean, as we sort of step back and look at businesses that have been successful during the pandemic and have prepared themselves for success post-pandemic, I think about maybe 4 just really easy takeaways. One, they're businesses that have strong leadership and culture. They have been proactive in their approach to changing circumstances. I think businesses that have sort of stood back and waited to take action have often missed out on opportunities. And I think businesses that have been proactive and really kind of looked at changing circumstances and seen how they can protect their employees and their businesses have thrived. I think clear communication channels, and Marie touched on this, especially within a business. I think employees, are now looking to their employer and wanting to know what that employer is doing to protect them. And I think that that's sort of something that is new in a lot of instances and is crucially important. And we see that with vaccination policies, right? Like when companies come out with a vaccination policy and they explain, we're encouraging vaccinations because we want to protect our employees, I think that resonates with employees. And then last, and we've touched on this repeatedly, is a strong policy foundation. Having the policies in place that a company needs to go to remote work and to address the situations that arise is vitally important. So we have just a couple minutes left, and we can take any remaining questions, but we want to thank you for joining us for this webinar, for all the questions. We've answered a number of them in the Q&A through typing. We've tried to answer them throughout. There is one interesting one that I just thought I would flag and see what you think about this, Marie. One of our attendees also mentioned workers' comp when we talk about relocation. And I think that's probably more also remote work. That's important, right? That you have sort of these layers of law that are often associated with an office space, but also apply to workers who are working at home.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really interesting one, and we're going to start seeing some of these cases. I've seen notifications coming through on some of the alerts that I have set up that certain kinds of cases have been filed, and there are a few cases that I think are kind of similar to this that are popping up in different jurisdictions now. So I think the answer is we're not quite sure. It'll probably depend in a lot of ways on your policies, the training that you've given to your employees, and like some of those things. So I'll just say, like, things you could do to mitigate the risk that it would qualify for workers' comp is give your employees training about what they are and aren't allowed to do while they're on the clock. If they are, running down the stairs because, the delivery man's at the door and they trip, I would say, well, maybe you could make the argument that, they're not on the clock right now. They're taking a break and they're doing something personal. And so it's kind of like if on their break from work, they decided to go out and, run down the street to get lunch or something. Like, that's a personal errand. So there's a lot of law around that already. And I think the idea of applying that pre-existing law to these new situations is something that I don't want to go too far and say, like, nope, you're totally fine. Or to also say, like, definitely covered. I think it's somewhere in between. It's going to be very fact-based and it's going to be policy-based. So giving your employees clear instructions about what they can and can't do while they're working, and how that would impact, think about how that impacts the benefits of remote work for your company as well.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. I think that's a great place to end. And it sort of segues into maybe a final takeaway in that this is a dynamic area. We are seeing sort of changed circumstances, and the law will continue to change over time, both with regard to workers' comp, but return to work generally, and just the workplace and the policies that govern it. And so, I think businesses that are staying up to date on those are going to be well positioned moving forward. Thank you again for joining us for this webinar. We hope you enjoyed your time. We've certainly enjoyed having you here, and we hope you'll join us for future 650 webinars.